Hello, this is Darren Elliott, and this is the Lives of Teachers podcast. And today I'm going to be talking to Jennifer Jenkins. This was an interview I've been looking forward to for quite a long time. And she's talking about English as lingua franca, or ELF, which is her, I suppose, her main area of expertise. If you're not familiar with English as lingua franca, I hope it will become clearer during the course of the interview. But to put it very, very basically, it's the variant or the variants of English which are occurring now in communication between non-native speakers of English. And it appears to be the case now that the majority of interactions in English are between non-native speakers of English, and most English communication these days doesn't involve any so-called native speakers of English. So, if that's the case, why do we need to speak like we come from Cambridge or from somewhere in the Midwest of the United States? Why can't we just speak however we speak? Of course, from a teaching perspective, it does cause some difficulties, which is perhaps one of the reasons why it's a controversial or not always a popular area of research. But it's not the fault of the speakers of English. It's something that we teachers need to address and deal with. I think it's a reality rather than a choice to deal with English as a lingua franca, or at least varieties of English other than the native speaker. Anyway, I'll let Jennifer Jenkins explain to you in much more eloquently and much more detail than I can. So please enjoy the interview. Before we start, though, if you're listening to this via iTunes, you can go to www.livesofteachers.com, and I'll put a few links to some interesting reading that will go with this particular interview. And if you're listening via the website in the first place, then please go along to iTunes and you can subscribe to this podcast, and you can get every episode freshly delivered to your computer via iTunes whenever I get round to putting another one up. So, without further ado, let's get on with the interview. Thank you very much. So I guess I should start off with probably your name will be most familiar to people from the two Oxford Applied Linguistics series books you've written. You started off with the phonology of English as an international language, and then English as lingua franca, attitude and identity. What was the change, first of all? Why did you change from English as an international language to English as lingua franca as a term?
Only because English as a lingua franca wasn't at all well known as a name. And when I did say in the very early pages of the first book, I think around page 10, 11, that I had already decided that the best way to name this phenomenon would be English as a lingua franca. And I really liked the fact that it just reversed two letters as well, which seemed a bit, quite neat. But when I tried to use it, nobody knew what I was talking about, so I said that reluctantly I was going to stay with English as an international language, which a lot of people had heard of by then. I mean, I started this research in the late 80s. This was my PhD, first of all, which I got I finished it, completed and got it in 95, and then spent a while thinking about writing it into a book. So this is quite old research, and I certainly wouldn't agree now with a lot of what I said in the 2000 book, because it was based on much older research. But I stuck with that title then simply because it was the title that, if anybody had heard of this field at all, that's what they knew. Then what happened was Barbara Seidelhofer got involved, and she wrote an article that became very, very well known in International Journal of Applied Linguistics, where she started to use English as a lingua franca, or ELF. And because of that, everybody started to hear of ELF, and although it was quite slow, it's become much, much better known as a name now. We even have an annual ELF conference. We've had two so far, and we're about to have the third this May. And then the fourth is going to be in Hong Kong in 2011. A lot of people have heard of it now. And, that was why I switched, but it was switching back to the name that I started with.
So where does it sit amongst the other? There are a lot of terms that are used. We mentioned sort of English as an international language, and maybe we hear global English or world Englishes. Where does it place, and is there any distinction, or?
The thing is, one thing that people have to accept is that this is all very new. Even World English is very new, but not nearly as very new as ELF. And that we get new evidence coming in all the time, and lots of research is being done. And because we're not all basically sort of narrow-minded and stupid, we do change the way we look at this phenomenon as we get more evidence. We don't just say, oh no, that's what I thought originally, I'm sticking with it. So my views have moved on. I've changed my views quite a bit over the last few years, as there's been much more evidence coming in, particularly from the voice corpus in Vienna and the alpha corpus in Helsinki. But sorry, I've actually forgotten what your question was.
How you distinguish the differences between...
Well, I think probably I would distinguish it because World English or Global English is still a very ambiguous term, but if we stick with World Englishes, which is a very defined and recognised term, they are still looking at Englishes in terms of traditional ways of looking at language varieties. So they are still looking at bounded languages. This region, this country has this type of English and it has these characteristics. This one has another. And so they've legitimised other people's, the native speakers' ways of speaking English, which is great. But the problem is that the world doesn't seem to be like that anymore. The world has changed since the World Englishes project started in the 70s. And it's much more like Alistair Pennycook talks about in his 2007 book, Global Englishes and Transcultural Flows. And ELF is much more with that, because ELF researchers, I think, would most of them, if not all, would say that you can't any longer talk about a fixed variety of English in a traditional sense in one place, and that we need to think about varieties of language, at least varieties of English, in a completely new sort of postmodern way. That most English is used, although this is not to say people don't speak English in India, local people with local people, or in Sri Lanka, local with local, and so on. They do. But a huge amount of English is used cross-nationally, cross-culturally, and probably, I hate to make claims about numbers, but I guess that numerically, especially because there's so many millions of Chinese speakers of English, that and they're not using it mainly with each other, they're using it for international and cross-cultural communication. So it's no longer so interesting to say, well, okay, what does China English look like? We have to look at it, because we have to look at why somebody in China, how somebody in China is likely to speak English. But the more interesting thing is not what that English looks like, it's what that person does when they speak English with somebody from somewhere else, and what happens to the language. The most interesting things are the transnational, transcultural flows, as Pennycook would put it, looking at what happens when you get people speaking English as a lingua franca. But you can't look at those as sort of fixed, bounded varieties, because they're very contingent, by which I mean they're very related to context. Who is speaking to whom, where they are, what they're speaking about. The same person will speak differently different times. That's always true, but it's much more true in English as a lingua franca. So although we're looking at the examples of the types of language, people have taken up my lingua franca core as if this is some fixed forever menu recipe for ELF. It's not. But although people do look at, you have to start by looking at what people actually, what evidence have you actually got. But we're only using that to find out more about the processes. Why do people change the way they speak? Why do people use particular pronunciations? Why do people use particular lexical forms and so on? And you get the evidence from it, but we're more interested in how it works, how people accommodate, particularly how people change the way they speak in lingua franca communication to make their selves more appropriate, more intelligible, more whatever. Actually, it's probably less about intelligibility and more about being appropriate and relevant for who you're speaking to. But this is all fairly new. I would say this way of speaking about Elf is maybe 2 to 3 years. And the thing that, World English is... Pennycook has argued that World English is as a concept is out of date. I don't think I'd agree with that. I think they do important work, but I'm not particularly interested in just what different nationalities do, because when you look at the expanding circle, by which I mean the countries where English is not a mother tongue and it's not an official sort of post-colonial language, it wasn't a colonised country, but it's a lot of the rest of the world, and it's the greater part of the world, in fact. China, Japan, Thailand, many parts of East Asia, all of Europe except for Britain, and all of Latin America and so on. So in all these places and parts of Africa, they're not speaking English with each other locally. So they're not developing these sort of so-called local varieties, which is why people are saying, so you can't talk about them as acceptable Englishes. But they're varieties in a completely different sense. They're ways of speaking to use English with other people who are not your local people. You can't look at speech community only in the sense of people who speak with other people in a local context anymore. Life isn't like that. The world has changed.
Well, let's pick apart a few points out of that. Let's start off with the lingua franca core that you mentioned. This was... I suppose, was it first in your 2000 book, or you obviously thought... You said you thought about this...
published elsewhere in small in journals and so on, but the first time that it became really public was in that book.
And what did that...
Books take a long time to write, and then they take a long time to get published. By the time it was published, even, I wouldn't have agreed with everything in it. So
let's say what it was... generally, and where it is now.
Okay, what it was, I'm most interested in accent. I've always been most interested in accent, and I was interested in the fact that it seems to be accents in English that caused the most problems when people were speaking to other people, and they seem to be the things that people most stigmatised in other speakers of English. And I was interested in what was going on, so I decided to do some research on this. So I decided to do it. Basically, that's why I decided to do a PhD. Some people decide to do a PhD and then hunt around for a subject. I had a subject and decided this is worth spending a few years on. So what I was trying to find out was... sorry, my email will make a loud noise every now and then to get your sound up so I can hear you and you me. I have to leave my email bell up. I was trying to find out because I still had a very much World English's view, so my view was that everybody's English was legitimate. There was no reason why just native English should be the English that the rest of the world should have to speak. English is a world language. So I started from that premise, but I accepted that English was used as a lingua franca more than anything else, and therefore we needed to find a way or there needed to be a way, because not me needed to find it, but there needed to be a way to help this expanding communication in ELF use, English lingua franca, which is in international languages. So I thought it would be very helpful if I could try and find out what were the things that caused the most difficulties and what were the things that really didn't cause difficulties, that just native speakers of English stigmatised, because that's not how we do it. So that's how I started off, and I just spent really 3, 4, 5 years. It carried on, but recording people having conversations with each other. Some were set up, but they were always authentic in the sense that they were doing something that they needed to do. So if I set them up, they were just doing some exam practice. They didn't realise at the time, that was before the days of very strict ethical codes came in. So although I told them afterwards, they weren't remotely interested in what I'd been doing. I felt I had to tell them afterwards what I'd been doing, why I'd recorded them. For their purposes, it was very useful, because they then heard their recordings as part of their exam practice and could hear what it was that they each didn't understand. So that was useful, and they could tell me more. But some of it was like that, and some of it was genuinely social events and so on. And I was recording and trying to find out what caused problems. And a lot of the time I could, because I could ask people.
So what?
I was there.
What particular?
Trying to find out what the problems were, so that I could then come up. I wish I hadn't called it lingua franca core, because this use of the word core has plagued me ever since. And people still write about it as if I believe ELF is this fixed core, and they've even said they think there's supposed to be a lexical core and a grammatical core. I mean, nobody said that.
From both of the books, you were fairly explicit, I think, that these were in some ways either a work in progress or this is something that is changeable.
I always said it wasn't definitive, and I always said that it wasn't an all-purpose thing. That is, I always said accommodation was just as important. And in the 2000 book, everybody who criticises the lingua franca core forgets about that huge chapter on accommodation, which has now become one of the main focuses of ELF research. Accommodation is now, people now realise how important it was, but nobody had talked about it in relation to English before then. And, you know, the fact I said that, you know, obviously you have to take accommodation into account, and, you know, people need to be able to adjust. So sometimes it might be useful to use one of these so-called core areas. Other times it won't help at all. You know, why would you use it if the other person didn't habitually do the other thing either? I mean, it's been criticised for a number of things. Some of the criticisms are totally valid. I mean, it is still based on RP, General American, you know, but there wasn't a way around that. You had to have something there. But I did start by looking at it in its own right. I was looking at what caused the problems. I wasn't starting by thinking that they should be saying a b or a p or a whatever, and that. But I was looking to find out what caused the problems. So
this this research took place initially when you were teaching. These were your own students.
I was mainly teacher training, but I was actually teaching. I kept teaching in classrooms so that I could get this research.
So you come at this. Your perspective, I suppose, in a way, was also to find ways that both learners of English and teachers could use or could find ways of speaking English without having to focus on native speaker norms.
Yeah, I mean, it was simply a way of because people always talked about pronunciation priorities, and I always thought, you know, these were totally intuitive. People would say something like schwa is very important, the sound is terribly important, but when you look at it, actually, the sound is only important to native speakers of English because that's what most of us do, not some in native groups, but most do. When you actually look at it, the use of the schwa, particularly in the weak forms, is actually a problem. It actually causes intelligibility problems, but it was intuitive. When people talk about the th sound and how important it is, it's only because it's important to native speakers because they know that it's people of lower classes of society tend to be the ones who don't have it. But these things are not important when you get into non-native, into ELF communication. And I was looking at a way of prioritising what really did matter so that people could try to learn those things so that they could use them when they needed to. I wasn't suggesting all the time, but when they needed, so that they would have them in their repertoire. But also I said that not just that, they needed to have practice in developing accommodation skills, working out how other people, people they're talking to are, what they do, and then how to switch to be more easily understood. So it was always like that, and it was, it was also a way of showing that the vast majority of features of pronunciation that are taught are actually perfectly okay for lingua franca communication. The only reason they're taught is because because that's what native speakers of English do. That was the only reason for teaching them.
We mentioned native speakers or non-native speakers. It's quite difficult to define what a native speaker and a non-native speaker is these days.
And I argued, some time ago, I gave a talk at a conference. I think it was in 1996. I gave a talk at a conference where I first presented these various dichotomies. So I had EFL on one side and then ELF on the other, and the audience had to try and guess what ELF was. Nobody did. And then I had... Actually, when somebody finally did it, it was at a different talk, and it was a non-native speaker who guessed it. It was a Brazilian who guessed ELF. And then I had native speaker and non-native speaker on one side, and then I had on the other side monolingual English speaker, MES, bilingual English speaker, BES, and they had to guess what those were as well. And I said at that talk that was the last time I was going to use the terms native and non-native speaker. Well, I had to eat those words because I couldn't do that. I had to carry on using them, because every time I tried to use something else, I had to spend 10 minutes explaining what my alternatives were. And when you get, conference, you maybe have half an hour if you're an ordinary speaker, maybe an hour if you're a keynote speaker, but whatever it is, you don't want to spend 10 minutes of your time just going over why you're not using native and non-native, because that becomes almost like the point of your talk, and it's not the point of my talk. There are plenty of people, and I've read something very recently, people arguing against this use. I see no reason within ELF, within English as a lingua franca, to refer to non-native speakers. Nobody is a native speaker of English as a lingua franca. So, by definition, if nobody's a native speaker, nobody's a non-native speaker. We all have to learn how to speak English as a lingua franca. It's easier if you're a native speaker of English, because your starting point has more of the structure in place than if you've never spoken any English in your life. Obviously, it's easier. On the other hand, it's harder to do it well, because you have so much preconception about what is good English, what is correct English, that there's a great resistance to using English any other way, or to accepting it any other way than the way you've grown up with. People won't accept that there's English as a native language. That's one kind. ELF is a different kind of English. So there are problems, but yeah.
So your interest specifically was about accent and phonology in the most part, but and I think that's something that is in some ways easier to understand, because we can't really say there's a native speaker accent. So I think if you can come from that starting point, you should be able to accept that an accent or certain pronunciation differences should be acceptable regardless of birthplace.
Yeah, I agree absolutely.
But what could be more difficult, and I think there's increasing work on other areas as well, of lexical, grammatical, pragmatic, and things like that, and that does create some difficulties. And I wanted to ask you about interlanguage. What do you think of the term interlanguage?
Horrible term.
Well, it's a well-accepted term for...
Well, you may say that, but at the AAAL conference, I don't know, AAAL, American Association of Applied Linguistics, it has an annual conference in the States, and there was one at the beginning of March. It's a very big, famous conference, and very, very eminent people give talks at it. And in this year's one, there was one of the keynote talks was by Lourdes Ortega, very famous second language acquisition researcher, who has, until a few years ago, certainly early in the last decade, certainly for the first half of the last decade, very much worked along the sort of traditional SLA approach into language and all the, what causes it and why don't people get native-like competence and so on. She gave her whole talk you can go to her website, it's there, you can access her PowerPoint, 108 PowerPoint slides, I think, and arguing in very, very strong terms against this notion. She would seem to be arguing it for all language learning, but just arguing against this notion of native speaker, non-native speaker, against this notion of incorrect non-native speaker second language, and looking at everything from the perspective of being bilingual is better, and that we have to stop judging language use according to the use of the native monolingual speaker and how they use that language.
Well, bilingualism
birthright has nothing to do with it, and all these things. So the second language, the SLA people, are moving on now away from this very old-fashioned interlanguage approach, where you just say that you have a native language and you have a target language, and you if you're lucky, you'll get some way from the first one to the second one, and whatever's left means you fossilise with the features that you haven't quite managed to acquire. Well, I can't speak for all languages. I don't know that I necessarily... there are reasons why that isn't good for any language learning in this modern world, but for English English, it's definitely no good. I mean, for English, you really can't talk any longer about the target being the native speaker. The people who are going to be the most disadvantaged over the next 10, 20, 30 years are going to be monolingual native speakers of English. They're the ones who are, it's already starting to show that they are becoming deeply disadvantaged. They don't even use English as well as anybody else in intercultural communication, but they don't have other languages, so they can't code switch, they can't join in conversations. When they're in sort of mixed language groups, people often do go backwards and forwards into other languages. It's creative, it's fun, it's useful when you don't have every word you need in English, which you most certainly don't. Because English doesn't have all the words that everybody needs. There are many things, I expect you speak Japanese. There must be words in Japanese that don't translate into English.
Certainly, yeah. There's certain things that sort of spring to the lips more readily than English, I think. But
people are always saying, how would I say that in English? And they try to explain a concept, and I say, well, I don't think we've got a word in English, in native English anyway.
But so I can certainly accept that a native speaker target is an unrealistic or perhaps a unnecessary one, but that leaves us with as a teacher, that leaves us with the difficulty what is an error and what's just a difference. It's a huge question, of course. But
ELF researchers, the people who are doing the empirical ELF research, will always say that they don't think. Well, they can't answer it at the moment, but they would also say that it's not their decision. So I would always say that it's for teachers to decide, to look at what we've produced and then decide what they think. And I think it's for local teachers as well, everybody within their own community, to decide, looking at the global situation, what do my learners need? One thing we do find very much, and there's a lot of debate going on about this at the moment, international universities. Every university around the world seems to want to call itself an international university or a global university. By that, they really seem to mean that they want international students who pay, especially in Britain, much higher fees. They want the money. Well, what actually happens is you get lots of international students coming to the UK, say, but to other places as well, and they mix mostly with each other from all over the place. So they're mixing in very much academic ELF groups and social ELF groups. They are acquiring enormously good ELF skills as they mix with each other. They are becoming very, very deeply aware that what they thought of as this native English target is not much use to them. Especially it won't be any use when they leave. I mean, even if they were to be mixing with the home students, which they mostly don't, partly because there aren't so many home students among postgraduates anyway, and partly because home students don't seem to want to mix with them particularly. The home students are very narrow-minded and, just mix with each other and don't want to make the effort, and tend to go home to different places, and the international students spend their time with each other, and they don't tend to speak much with the people outside in the city, and whether that was London where I was before or Southampton where I am now, they mix with each other, they acquire ELF skills, they realise that the world isn't like it used to, or isn't like they were told, that when they learnt English they were told, oh, you need either this British English or this American English, and even the English they do hear isn't what they were told they would hear, because native speakers don't speak the way they were told native speakers speak. Tiny percentage have a Jalpi accent. And, they hear a lot of substitutions of the. They hear a lot of so-called dropped H's and all the sorts of things they were told not to do. And they realised that what on earth was the point of this target, this invented target, this idealised target that is at the one end of the interlanguage continuum.
But there are still those, though. This is something that came up in the Attitude and Identity, the more recent book. That I found very interesting, and also, from my own experience, I've noticed this too, that we'll say non-native, for want of a better word, but non-native speakers and non-native, very proficient non-native speakers of English, teachers of English, they still often strive for, or they see a native English as the target, and they feel insecure perhaps, or inferior about their own variety.
I mean, I've never said that people should be forced not to learn that target and acquire it. I do think it's a matter of choice. I do think, though, that it should be an informed choice, and therefore it should be after being made aware of what the world is like in terms of English, who speaks it, where they speak it, and so on and so on. But we do have this problem at the moment. I think attitudes are changing quite fast, actually. I think, especially among younger people, but I mean, there are people, especially slightly older teachers and so on, who really do feel unconfident and feel, the parents of the people they teach kids, and the parents expect them to teach them native-like English. And, they're made to feel bad. I mean, a lot of the people I spoke to in that book, they just felt very bad because they felt they couldn't speak like a native speaker, and that was expected of them. But often it was because they were teachers. I do think that among younger people, things are changing. It's hard to believe. I sometimes have to remind myself that it was 10 years ago that Green Book was published, and that it was considered to be, I don't know, like a total, like a blasphemy, a treason. These ideas in that book were considered to be absolutely outrageous and unthinkable. And when you look now at how so many people just take this for granted, they just think, well, of course you shouldn't be expecting people to sound, to speak native-like English, to learn RP and so on. What happened was at the same conference in AAAL in Atlanta at the beginning of March, there was a panel on ELF, and there was huge interest shown in it. And if American researchers are starting to get interested in it, they're going to start writing about it. And in Lourdes Ortega's keynote, she mentioned it. She mentioned my work, she mentioned Barbara Seidelhofer's work, she mentioned other work that's related to that. They are starting to take notice of the fact, and I think it's probably because language is entirely political, and it's probably because actually China is becoming the more powerful of the two. US is becoming less powerful. China is becoming more powerful politically in the world. China is full of English speakers who speak China English, so they're not speaking English like Americans do, and they're not going to. There's too many of them to feel they have to make that effort. And they're saying very insensible, interesting things. There was a conference last Thursday and Friday. I don't know. Well, it was here in Britain. It was in London. I didn't go to it, but it was on. A lot of it was online. Some of the keynotes. It was the Global University or something like that, and there were people from all around the world, but mainly from Britain and the US, a bit few from Australia, and they were all talking about what a global international university would look like. Generally on the panels, where they had 3 or 4 or 5 people giving talks, you had the Americans and the Brits, and they were saying they were reeling out all the usual sort of, the platitudes and the sort of the ideas about, how people should assimilate if they go to another, if non-native speakers go to Britain, say, and then the really interesting things being said in quite clearly not native-like accents were being said by the Chinese, the Taiwanese, the Malaysians. There were various people from various countries who had very, very interest, and they were talking about, they were the ones, there's all this talk about only native speakers, only Britain and only the West can be critical, can go in for criticality, and everybody else, particularly in this so-called East, this East-West division people talk about. In the East, of course, they just accept everything.
I find it very frustrating from this perspective. That's something I have to hear sometimes. It's quite frustrating to hear that sometimes.
It's awful, because what we had was no criticality at all being expressed by the native-speaking participants, and the criticality was all coming from the East, people from the East. So it seems like somebody was saying, well, everyone talks about world class, but whose world are we talking about? And they were critiquing the whole idea of international and what Westerners think international is, and they were very clearly being critical, and there was no sense of this. You see, so, all these things are happening. and as I say, language is political. Accent seems to me to be particularly political. And we're moving into a new era with English language teaching. It's going to be changing, I predict. Going back to what you asked, what do teachers do? Well, I have suggested sort of, not like a recipe, what teachers would teach in classrooms, but things that teachers might want to think about. I think I put it in the 2007 book. I put it in a talk I gave for IATEFL as well, and wrote in the proceedings of 2004 conference. Things like, doing their, being the people who make up their own minds, observing what goes on and thinking about what their own learners need in terms of sort of more global communication and, what their learners need in the future if they're not going to be mainly talking to native English speakers. What things would be important, doing some action research in their own classrooms. And maybe... if they're going to teach any pronunciation, if we go back to accent, maybe looking at the things that do seem... Because the lingua franca core, people have replicated quite a lot, and there's been very little disagreement. So maybe taking some of the things that are found... have been most found to not... people have mostly agreed with, or the least disagreement about it, and the strongest cases that were made there, and accepting, okay, so we won't teach that thing, or we will teach that thing if it's something that seemed to be necessary, and forget about the rest. We can have our own way of pronouncing certain vowels and so on. Nobody needs stress-timed language. I mean, nobody.
Well, there are some other things too. You mentioned a few times Barbara Seidelhofer, right? Yeah. And she did some very interesting research into grammatical similarities between sort of varieties of English lingua franca, and a lot of things that she noticed. Like the third person singular present tense s. The tag questions, which have similarities, and if you read through it looks like a course textbook.
Grammatical sins, she's called it.
It looks like it looks like a best of textbook. But basically, what we can see is that these things actually make no difference at all to comprehensibility. It doesn't matter if you say he make lunch.
And when you think about the present tense of the English verbs, I mean, I don't know if you. I mean, I did an English language degree, and we had to learn Old English. The English of the 8th century, and in the Old English days, all 6 parts of the present tense had a different ending. Only one of those endings is now left, and it's simply a marker of membership of a native English community. It serves no purpose at all, and it will die out. It's already died out among some native groups, but as they're the stigmatised native groups, that's why there's so much resistance among other native speakers. But it serves no purpose, and and other things like the uncountable nouns become incountable, and the tag questions. These are all just parts of normal regularisation that's happened with native English right through the centuries. The big objection now is simply that it's non-native speakers who are leading these changes, and native speakers find that difficult to accept. So do some non-native speakers. I mean, Barbara Seidelhofer didn't just invent these. I mean, what she did, she produced this corpus of ELF, Vienna Oxford International Corpus of English, which is now online. You can access it free online. It's over 1 million words, and every conversation is transcribed, and you can see exactly who was speaking with who, where they were, what was going on, if they laugh, if they, the whole thing is so carefully done. And she then drew some inferences from what the corpus showed. She hasn't produced these as recipes for what teachers should do. She's just saying that we find a lot of this. Some people say, well, when you look at it, look at this and say, well, there's X examples of uncountable being used as accountable. So you get X numbers of informations, plural, and many, many more examples of information uncountable. But the point is that when changes like this start and the changes in progress, of course it starts with a small number. Of course the number of tokens is small to start with, but it's a sign, very likely it's a sign of a change in progress. And there will come a time when you see more. And of course you have to remember that with all the ethical stuff these days, everybody knew they were being recorded. So, there is of course a sort of tendency, even if you're not trying to, but there's a tendency to do what you think is, in your mind is correct English, even though you may, it just happens.
But David Graddle says that demographics is the most important thing that's going to change the future of English.
Yeah, that's probably right.
So, I mean, you could say that it doesn't matter whether you agree or you like the idea of ELF. Resistance is futile. It's going to happen. I have said that myself. I think it's going to happen whatever people think of it and whatever people want. I think it will happen. And what always interests me is, for example, I gave a talk to a Polish group some years ago, and they were very resistant. They were very rude about this idea. They've written very rude articles about this. And then, but all they did was they had stayed in Poland. They had been taught very, very British English with a very RP accent. That's the whole thing that goes on in the Polish universities. And they'd never really come across this notion, and also they'd never travelled and mixed in lingua franca communication. And then one of them, who'd been one of the most scathing about this, went off to work in Paris. And it was quite interesting to read an article she wrote after being in Paris for 18 months, where she was clearly using English as a lingua franca. Suddenly this didn't matter so much anymore. She'd sort of changed her mind about ELF. And it just happens when people hear about it and learn about it, and then, but more importantly, actually experience it. And more people are going to do that because of this transnational world we live in. More and more people. Often now I go to conferences and there are more, there are many more non-native speakers of English there, and they're all speaking with each other and they're using English, and, they're learning that from first-hand experience. So, it's going to happen. David Graddle's right. Well, I think that's a good point to conclude. So, thank you very much. Okay, well, sorry for the slightly abrupt ending there, but that was Jennifer Jenkins, and a very enjoyable interview for me. Please go along to the website at www.livesofteachers.com, and you can search, or you can look at the tabs on the side and find more information about the things that we talked about. I should say that this interview took place in March 2010, so I'm not sure when you're listening to this, but if that helps you, it might be interesting to know. Other than that, I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and this is Darren Elliott signing off. Thank you very much.